This is an episode of Unconfined, the podcast of the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future in Baltimore, Maryland. Unconfined is a podcast about industrial food animal production and its emerging alternatives. You can find us online at clf.jhsph.edu. Mike Milley is our sound engineer and produced our theme music. Your hosts are me, Christine Grillo, and Tom Philpott. Paulette O'Leary is our producer, and Natalie Woodwright is the executive producer. The opinions expressed here are not necessarily those of Johns Hopkins University or of the Center for a Livable Future.
Hello and welcome to Unconfined Podcast. We're doing an episode this week on PFAS, which are a class of industrial chemicals that have become ubiquitous in modern life and are also, unfortunately, quite toxic. And because we're kind of a food and agriculture related podcast, we're going to explore just one of the ways that PFAS get into our bodies, into our food. And the way that we're going to discuss starts with farmers applying a pretty cheap and potent fertilizer to their fields known as biosolids, or more descriptively as sewage sludge. This is basically the solids left over from wastewater treatment plants. And human waste isn't actually the problem here. The problem is that these treatment plants mix industrial waste with human waste. The treatment takes away the pathogens from human waste, so that's not really a problem, but it can't do much for a lot of the industrial waste. And that is the way that PFAS makes its way into sewage sludge. And to explain what all this means and its implications, we could not have two better guests that I can think of. We have Mariah Blake, who is a fantastic journalist and author of the recently published book, They Poison the World, Life and Death in the Age of Forever Chemicals, which I've been reading and is amazing. And we have Adam Nordell, who is a former farmer in Maine, and we're going to hear about how PFAS-infected sewage sludge really kind of put his farm out of business. We're going to hear that story, and we're going to hear about the activism that he's been doing, the advocacy he's been doing since then to make sure this doesn't happen anymore. And I want to start, Mariah, if you could talk a little bit about what PFAS are, maybe spell out what these letters all stand for, and how they became so ubiquitous in our food supply, in our bodies, and basically everywhere now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an honor. I just want to say it's an honor to be on with the two of you. I admire both of your work. So what are PFAS? So these chemicals are generally known. The more common name for them is forever chemicals because they don't break down in the environment. But the technical term for them is or polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, and you'll be hearing that term a lot throughout the course of this conversation. And so PFAS are a large class of substances with some really amazing properties. They're extremely resistant to heat, stains, grease, electrical current. They stand up to extremely corrosive chemicals that burn through everything else, including stainless steel. And this has made them incredibly useful. So they helped usher in the era of space travel and high-speed computing. They've paved the way for life-saving medical devices. They have also found their way into thousands of everyday items, everything from kitty litter and dental floss to lipstick and children's clothing. So they are in all of our blood. They are in all of our homes. Which points to the other point I want to make about them, which is that they are probably the most insidious pollutants in all of human history. So we're talking about a class of chemicals that persist in the environment for hundreds or even thousands of years. And in fact, one of the industry documents I came across in the course of my research estimated that a certain PFAS had a half-life of 1 million years. So that is far longer than plutonium. we're talking about a time scale that is more akin to nuclear waste. These chemicals are also highly toxic, even in minuscule doses, and they're literally polluting the entire planet, including human blood and ecosystems in the remotest parts of the world. So there's been a lot of talk recently, a lot of media coverage about microplastics. These chemicals are everywhere that you find microplastics. In fact, they're maybe even more ubiquitous. And the evidence tying them to disease in humans particularly is far more robust. So there is a large and very robust body of science showing that they are linked to a long list of diseases in people.
Hey, can you talk a little bit? One thing I've learned from your work is that the sort of federal government had a lot to do with their origins. And can you talk about that and how it was clear they were toxic from the very start?
That's one of the things I found most shocking in the course of reporting my book. And that is that these chemicals were developed by the US government as part of the top secret Manhattan Project. And the reason they were needed was for uranium enrichment. So uranium enrichment involved this extremely corrosive chemical that burned through everything. So including steel, as I spoke about earlier. And Manhattan Project scientists determined that the only materials that could stand up to this chemical that was needed for uranium enrichment were those that involved fluorine and carbon. So those two elements together form the strongest bond in chemistry. But none existed. So there was one that existed naturally, and there are a couple that had been accidentally invented in labs, but basically they did not exist. They could not be produced on scale. So the Manhattan Project actually launched a program to develop these substances, which were then known as fluorocarbons, that are now known as PFAS, just as there were physicists in labs all over the country working to develop nuclear fuels and the bomb itself. There were chemists all over the country working to develop PFAS. And they began mass producing them in New Jersey in 1943 as part of the bomb project. Now, it was clear, as you mentioned, from the get-go that these were dangerous chemicals. So the plants where they produced them were routinely catching fire. Explosions were commonplace. Workers were often hospitalized for breathing problems or chemical burns. But it wasn't just workers who were affected. And you'll see that farmers are sort of a thread that runs through this story from beginning to end. But almost as soon as this plant started operating, farmers downwind of the plant began complaining that their peach crops were burning up, that their cows were so crippled they couldn't stand. They had to graze by crawling on their bellies. And in some cases, the farmers themselves were falling ill after eating produce they'd picked. So the farmers complained to DuPont, and they knew this was a government program, to government officials. But now Manhattan Project brass was extremely concerned about this. They worried that the farmers would sue and that would compromise the secrecy of the project, and that would open the government and its contractors up to liability. So the Manhattan Project launched a special division that secretly studied the health effects of fluorocarbons, or PFAS, and other special Manhattan Project materials. So as part of this program, they also injected unknowing cancer patients with plutonium.
Wow.
Yeah. But so the U.S. government, as part of this secret bomb project, started researching the health effects of these chemicals in 1943. And by 1947, government scientists had determined that they were highly toxic and that they were accumulating in human blood. And that's one of the things that makes these chemicals particularly harmful, is that they build up in the blood and they stay there for a long time. Interestingly, this program continued it under the auspices of the Atomic Energy Commission. And by the 1970s, scientists, as part of that program, had discovered that these chemicals were in the blood of people all over this country, even in places where there was no obvious source. So no manufacturing emissions, for example. And that fact, I'll just put a pin in it there, but it is tied to the sewage sludge story.
And okay, so you would think that they made this discovery, these chemicals are useful, but they're highly toxic. How do we go from government labs to mass production by DuPont and 3M? And like, what was the decision-making process? And how did they get the intellectual property to do that anyway?
After the war, 3M, a Minnesota-based company that most people have heard of, it licensed a technology to produce PFAS, and it hired Manhattan Project chemists to turn them into products that it could market either to other companies for use in manufacturing or to the general public. So one of the first products that was produced with these was Scotchgard. Teflon is another one. So Teflon was manufactured by DuPont, but with an additive that was manufactured by 3M. And that additive would turn out to be extremely toxic. So that is how they went from exotic chemicals that were used in the bomb project to substances that are in, thousands of everyday products that are in all of our homes.
And no one thought maybe this was a bad idea because they're so toxic.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So industry was aware that they were toxic very, very early on. So as early as the 1960s, in the case of 3M, it was as early as the 1950s. They knew that it was accumulating in the blood of people all over this country in the 1970s. In fact, it was a bomb project scientist shared that information with 3M, which then went and tested thousands of samples from people all over the world and found the same was true, even in areas like remote rural China. And in fact, the only sample, after testing thousands of samples from all over the world, the only blood 3M could find that didn't contain these chemicals was blood that was collected from Korean war vets before 1952. So before these chemicals went into wide-scale production. They knew that they have a devastating effect on lab animals. They had associated them with all kinds of very serious diseases in workers, including birth defects and cancer and organ damage. But they buried these findings because the profit motive was too strong. The incentive to not produce them was modest compared to the incentive to produce them because our system for regulating chemicals in this country is extremely weak. So they could really withhold this information from regulators for quite a long time without there being any consequences.
Well, everyone should read Mariah's book to get more information on this, just corporate crime, essentially. But let's fast forward for now to the 21st century and up to Maine. And Adam, talk a little bit about Songbird and what happened with sewage sludge. How did it come onto your land, and what were the impacts?
Sure. Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Mariah, for the opportunity to chat with you both. I very much appreciate your work and the opportunity to connect with you. My name is Adam Nordell, and I'm a campaign manager at an environmental health organization called Defend Our Health, which is based here in Maine, that seeks to reduce people's exposure to toxic chemicals. So my wife and I ran a certified organic vegetable and grain farm in central Maine that was called Songbird Farm. We were marketing within our community. We had a community-supported agriculture program and sold through a statewide distributor to natural food stores here in the States. We had close relationships with our customers. We're embedded within the very strong local foods community in Maine. And we're farming essentially we were a mission-driven farm. All farmers are mission-driven farms, but we were focused on the production of clean, healthy, fresh food for our community. And in late 2021, we got some disturbing news from a customer of ours who discovered a pin on our farm located on a map published by the Maine Department of Environmental Protection that highlighted areas that had been historically licensed to receive sewage sludge as a fertilizer application. This was total news to us. We'd owned the farm at that point for 7 years. We'd been farming for 12 years, first on leased land. And then once we built our business, built our markets, built our farm brand and our customer base, we took the leap and got a mortgage and purchased a piece of land that had been managed by another organic farmer, a fellow named Tim Christensen, who was dying of pancreatic cancer. He was in his mid-60s and was really committed to organic agriculture and land conservation and wanted to make sure that his farm continued on as an organic farm after he passed away. So we purchased from him in late 2014. and ran our business, grew our business there until the end of 2021 when we got this disturbing email from a friend and customer. Saying, I don't know what this means. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but this is something that you might want to investigate.
And so what happened when you investigated?
So we had our soil and our water tested and learned that our soil and water were both severely contaminated with PFAS. This was an emerging story in Maine at this point. Fred Stone of Stone Ridge Farm in Arundel, Maine, had famously been impacted by PFAS that was discovered in 2016, but not widely publicized outside of the dairy farming community in Maine. So we were vaguely aware that there was something called PFAS that had impacted a few dairy farms, but nobody was talking to vegetable farmers or grain farmers about it. Lo and behold, very long story short, we learned that in the 4 years prior to Tim Christensen buying the land, our farm had been a satellite field owned by a dairy farm in the area that received this wastewater treatment plant sewage sludge, also known as by the euphemism of biosolids, as a fertilizer from 1991 through 1994. So 4 applications, 4 corn crops fertilized, 4 hay crops fertilized, and 30 years later, we found astronomically high levels of PFAS in our soil, our water, in some of our vegetables, and in our blood. So ultimately, that led us to shut down the farm and move off site, and led to me entering the advocacy world.
And is there any compensation available for people who have been affected by that? Were you compensated for your land in any way? How does that work?
It's very hard with a bunch of my farmer peers who were likewise impacted, a bunch of farmers of my generation who'd gotten their start in the past 10 or 15 years and built businesses, made similar discoveries. They weren't the farmers who spread the sludge, but learned sort of alongside me and my wife that they had similar problems. In many cases, not quite as bad, but still bad enough. We were all shocked and dismayed by this and pushed the legislature to take action. And alongside our peers in the nonprofit community who were pushing alongside unimpacted but concerned farmers and the general public, we were able to get the legislature to, 1, ban the land application of sewage sludge so we stop contaminating farmland, and 2, create a pool of resources to help people deal with the impacts. This was, it threw my family out of business with our farm. It poses really serious health risks, as Mariah elucidated. These chemicals last in the human body for many decades, and they're linked with a bunch of terrible illnesses. And that's a lot for someone to shoulder who had nothing to do with the contamination.
Adam, can I just interject for a second? When you talk about the legislature, you're talking about the Maine legislature. So Maine has been a leader on this, but nationwide farmers are not being compensated. And land application has not been banned anywhere but Maine. So I just want to clarify that for listeners.
Thank you for that.
And that's largely because of Adam's work and the work of other farmers in Maine, that Maine has really taken strong action on this. But that's not happened anywhere else.
Thank you for that clarification.
Mariah, yeah, and let's talk a little bit about sewage sludge, biosolids, and how long has the EPA known that they may contain PFAS?
So the answer is tied up with the industry cover-up that I alluded to earlier. So as I said, 3M knew since the 1970s that this chemical was in the blood of people all over the country. It continued to collect data and about its presence in human blood, but did not disclose it until the EPA until the late 1990s. And what happened at that point was university laboratories had developed technologies that could detect these chemicals in human blood. Up until that point, the technology was dominated by industry. And this meant that an independent scientist could find these chemicals in blood and trace them back to 3M. And some of these chemicals were only manufactured by 3M. So at that point in the late 1990s, 3M disclosed to the EPA its blood findings. And this created a good deal of concern, not surprisingly, among EPA officials, and EPA officials began demanding that 3M turn over more internal data, which showed the devastating health effects that these chemicals had on lab animals, what it had done to 3M workers. And at this point, the EPA began demanding that 3M start investigating just how widespread the contamination is. So as part of an agreement with the EPA, beginning in the late 1990s, 3M, and they did what they called a multi-city study. So they looked at a number of U.S. cities. They looked at the levels of PFAS in the environment, in sewage discharges, in food, to try to figure out how these chemicals were getting into human blood. That was the main question. And the final report was issued in 2001. So this was as part of this whole public process with the EPA. And that report found that there were astronomical levels of PFAS in sewage sludge in communities where there was industry that discharged them. So one of the cities was Decatur, Alabama, I think. And so there the levels were, it was Decatur, Alabama, am I correct? So in that city, and I have to look at the specific statistic, but the levels were millions of times higher than the EPA's current safety standard for the two best studied of these chemicals in drinking water. And that translated into high levels in food. So they looked at apples and beef and green beans and all kinds of food bought from grocery stores in that community. And there were also very high levels of PFAS. But I think even more concerning, even in communities with no obvious source of PFAS contamination, so no industries that emitted PFAS, there were high levels in the sewage sludge. So tens of thousands of times the EPA's current safety standard. And these chemicals were also in food in those communities. So this was known to the EPA back in 2001. It was there are multiple reports that are hundreds and hundreds of pages that spell this out. But the EPA didn't do anything with that information. So even after these findings were released, the EPA continued to encourage farmers to spread this sewage sludge on their farms. And the sludge is distributed as part of an EPA promoted program that's been in existence since the 1970s. So that is how long the EPA has known, since at least 2001.
And there are still no regulations on it except for in Maine.
That is correct. As far as I know, Adam is on the forefront of that. So he can speak to whether there are other states that are looking to enact or on the verge of enacting.
Yeah, and Adam, I want you to respond to that and also talk a little bit about how Maine emerged as such a hotspot for this. And I'm wondering, is it all sewage sludge that has PFAS, or is it from areas where there's a lot of PFAS production? And how did that make it up to Maine? What was the connection there?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for that question. As Mariah said, PFAS shows up in sewage sludge both where there's a heavy industry that's an industrial user or producer of PFAS. So not surprising. Is it 3M in Decatur, Alabama? I can't remember if it's 3M or DuPont there. But they're manufacturing the PFAS. It winds up in their wastewater. It winds up in the sludge and at astronomically high levels in those local farm fields. In Maine, one of our legacy industries is the paper mill industry. And so those were the paper mills use PFAS in the paper making process, as I understand it, to get the paper pulp onto and off of the rollers as they're actually manufacturing the paper. But there are also a number of paper products that are directly treated with PFAS for its end use as a consumer product. So you think about Chinette cups, plates, and bowls, disposable plates and whatnot.
And that is still true in 2025. They're still doing that.
Yes. So so certain PFAS have been phased out. But the vast majority of the 9,000 PFAS in circulation are still in circulation. And I would just like to add that there are two other ways that PFAS find their way into sewage sludge. And a big one is firefighting foam. So since the 1960s, basically every firehouse, military base, and airport in this country and around the world has used PFAS-based firefighting foam. And the firefighters who used it were told that it was safe as soap. So they trained with it, they dumped it into sewer systems, they dumped it in near water supplies. And so basically every military base in the country is extremely polluted with these chemicals. And the runoff, and they're discharging the foam and waste from the foam into sewer systems. And another source is consumer products, because these chemicals are so ubiquitous in our homes that also finds its way into the sewer system. But I think firefighting foam is a big reason that you're finding it at high levels in sewage sludge, even in places where there's no known polluting industries.
Right. So there's a certain background level that's going to find its way into sewage sludge. And then in places where it's produced, it's going to be even more astronomical.
Well, the firefighting foam is a major source of contamination. It's one of the leading sources of PFAS contamination worldwide. And so that is a big factor. It's not just background. It's a major contributing factor to the level of PFAS in sewage sludge and in drinking water.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. And we know that farmland contamination from the AFFF firefighting foam is severe across the country. But I did just want to talk about the background contamination. That the word background contamination suggests that it's somehow acceptably low, and that's definitely not the case. In 2018, Maine Centers for Disease Control worked with our Department of Environmental Protection to set health-based limits for PFAS in sludge. So this is after the first couple of PFAS-impacted farms were identified here, and the state was trying to grapple with protecting communities of farmers and also rural well owners and farm workers. The whole rural community was getting poisoned. And they said, okay, what's a safe level? We know there's too much going out. What's a safe level? And they, using now outdated toxicology assumptions, they settled on very low single-digit numbers, 2.5 parts per billion PFOA and 5.2 parts per billion PFOS. And then they required all wastewater treatment districts to sample their sludge and report back. And 95% of the wastewater treatment districts in the state of Maine had more PFOA and PFOS in their sludge than that. So that includes, yes, the wastewater districts that had a paper mill dumping wastewater into their sewer, but it also includes very small towns with no industry whatsoever. Maybe a car wash as a point source of PFAS, but maybe not. Sampling across the country has identified that often residential communities have just as much PFAS in their wastewater as industrial neighborhoods. So as Mariah said, the contribution of PFAS in consumer products to our waste stream and to our wastewater stream, and ultimately to our farms and to our food supply, is unacceptable. It's posing a real risk to the health of farming communities across the country.
And I'd like to just build on what Adam said. So the EPA has determined that there is no safe level of the two best studied PFAS, so PFOA and PFOS. They've set drinking water standards that are 4 parts per trillion, which is the lowest level you can reliably detect, but the health-based standards are 0. And so, breast milk all over the world contains levels that are higher than the EPA safety standards. So I think with other chemicals, you consider background to be, potentially safe. But in this case, the entire world is essentially contaminated with levels that science tells us are unsafe for human health. So that I want to underscore what Adam said. In this case, background does not mean it's a safe level of exposure.
Yeah, I did not mean to imply that, but I totally get what you guys are saying. And so we have this terrible problem, and obviously there's no easy solution to it, but there are things that could be done. So why don't you both, maybe Adam, can you talk a little bit about the regulatory responses and what you see happening and what could be happening in a more ideal world? You guys are painting a dire picture, as you should be, because this is quite a dire situation that we're looking at. So let's start with you, Adam, and the farm sewage sludge situation.
Sure, thanks. So the two categories of policy or regulatory response that I would think about are, one, turning off the tap. We don't want more of this in our lives as consumers. We definitely don't want more of it in our food supply. And then secondly, how do we manage what's out there? How do we keep farmers in business and keep the food supply safe, given the PFAS load that's already out there in our farming communities? So in the first bucket, turning off the tap, we know that getting PFAS out of production ultimately benefits all of us. That ultimately gets it out of our waste stream. That ultimately reduces the amount of pollution going out into the environment, including to our farms. But this story has really shown, by way of example, everything that we don't know about sewage sludge, everything that we don't know about our wastewater when it's being sent to farms as a fertilizer. We're talking about PFAS now. EPA has known for a long time. But what emergent categories of chemicals are we missing? Will people be talking about 20 years from now when it's too late for those farms? So really fundamentally, the practice of using sewage sludge as a fertilizer is unsafe. All sludge contains too much PFAS to be safe for the farming communities. EPA just affirmed that last year. They released a document that said virtually all sludge is contaminated above a level that would pose a cancer risk to farmers. So you can either ban the land application of sludge, or you can set very low health protective thresholds, and the wastewater districts can use the tools at their disposal to try to meet those thresholds. And if they can do it, all right, good for them. But one way or another, we need to stop polluting our farmland with PFAS. And secondly, with all of the farms that are already impacted, that are already contaminated, we need to support those farmers. Farmers want to produce safe food, and we need to help them do that, because this is a society-wide problem that's been dumped on us by 3M and DuPont and Chemours. Fortunately, there are crops that are less likely to uptake the chemicals than others. There are emerging management practices that you can get PFAS out of a dairy herd. So we're seeing strategies emerge through which farmers can responsibly and safely stay in production, stay in business. But it takes an investment to do that. It might take 12 months without profit, without any money coming in, while covering all of the costs of running a dairy, of milking the cows and moving the manure and bringing in the crops. That's more than a farmer can shoulder. But we have this model here in Maine with our PFAS safety net. And that model is written into federal legislation as well. The Relief for Farmers Hit with PFAS Act would create a safety net nationwide. And there are numerous state level legislation. There are bills in states across the country that would try to do both of these things: protect farmers from getting contaminated and help them once they are impacted.
And just one more question for you, Adam. Do you think that what you experienced in Maine and what other farmers experience in Maine are we going to see a lot more farmers in other areas and other regions experience the same thing? Are we just sort of like sitting on a ticking time bomb? Because as you guys have both pointed out, the EPA has been actively encouraging farms to use this for decades, even after it knew that it was essentially and literally, to borrow the title of Mariah's book, poisoning the world through this chemical that's going out. So are we going to hear about, like, I'm thinking of places like, I think I was just reading about North Carolina finding a bunch of PFAS on the beach. And there's a plant in Fayetteville that was probably discharging it. And there's a lot of farms around there. Are we going to start seeing other outbreaks, so to speak?
Yes.
Yeah. We certainly are, and we have already.
This is absolutely just the tip of the iceberg. So we're going to see this in every state. What's happening in Maine, where there's widespread contamination of farms. The only reason that it's emerged in Maine as an issue before it's emerged anywhere else is because Maine is the only place that's systematically tested for PFAS in places where sewage sludge has been applied. But we know that sewage sludge has been applied to about 70 million acres of farmland all across this country. And anywhere they've tested, they've found it. So it's a huge issue that has massive implications for our food supply that just has not been explored yet. Really, we don't know the extent of the problem, but it's clear that it's a major problem and that it's something that every state is going to have to reckon with going forward. And I should note that PFAS, the number one source of exposure to these chemicals for most people is food. So, and we don't fully understand how PFAS gets into our food supply because that research just hasn't been done yet. But one key route is clearly sewage sludge. So I think this has major public health implications. We don't know the exact scope of it, but it is a huge problem that needs to be addressed urgently.
On the sort of bigger regulatory question, Adam pointed out the, just glaringly obvious fact that if we want to address this problem, we have to cut the spigot off. We have to turn the spigot off. And I wonder if, Mariah, you could talk a little bit about where we are with that. Like, is that in play, or are they shifting to other less studied PFAS that we don't know as much about so they can keep using them? Like, what's going on here?
The answer to both questions is yes. So on a federal level, industry has agreed to phase out the two most notorious PFAS. And in fact, they were phased out a decade ago. And what industry did in response was it shifted to a newer group of PFAS. So the older generation were characterized by long carbon chains swaddled in fluorine. They're called long chain PFAS. And so industry switched to shorter chain PFAS, so ones with shorter carbon chains. And it claimed that they were safer because they don't stay in the human body as long, which is true in some cases. However, it turns out that despite that, a lot of these replacement chemicals are more toxic than the older generation. And in other ways, they are far more problematic. So they are more mobile in the environment. So one of the things that distinguishes these chemicals from most other chemicals is that they're attracted to water, they're hydrophilic, and as a result, they move through the environment more readily. They move through the upper atmosphere and fall with rain all around the world. And in fact, levels of rain everywhere in the world exceed the EPA's safety standards for drinking water. So the new generation are far more mobile than their predecessors. They build up more quickly in crops, leading to higher levels in the food chain, and they are more difficult to remove from drinking water. So it is virtually impossible to remove some of the shorter chain ones from drinking water. The only technology that can do it in many cases is reverse osmosis, but that's way too expensive to deploy on a commercial scale. So for a water utility. However, there is some good news. There is some good news on the PFAS front. States have been watching what's happening on a federal level and the way that, one bad chemical has simply been replaced by another bad chemical. And you have this very powerful movement of citizen activists, people like Adam, whose lives have been upended by PFAS, and they have been demanding action on the state and federal level. They haven't made a huge amount of headway on the federal level, but on the state level, they've made an enormous amount of headway. And so what you have is states passing very aggressive PFAS regulation that addresses the entire class of chemicals. So states are banning the entire class of chemicals, and this avoids that situation where you simply replace one bad chemical with another. So 30 US states so far have passed at least 200 laws restricting PFAS, including at least 16 full or partial bans on the entire class of chemicals in consumer goods or in some consumer goods. And this is a sea change because that is not how we regulate chemicals in this country. We normally regulate them one by one. And in fact, this is the first time that a group of chemicals have been regulated in a class this way. But the United States is not the only place where this is happening. So the European Union is weighing a class-wide ban on these chemicals as well. In addition, you have a huge volume of litigation against manufacturers. So at least 15,000 lawsuits are pending against manufacturers. This is a wave of litigation that will dwarf the big tobacco litigation, the asbestos litigation, any similar legal battle in U.S. history. And as a result of these two factors, the rising tide of legislation and the rising tide of litigation, you have huge swaths of the market voluntarily migrating away from PFAS. So 3M, the world's largest manufacturer of these chemicals, has announced that it will quit producing them by the end of this year. That is a huge victory for public health. 40 major retail chains with nearly $2 trillion in combined annual sales have committed to reducing or eliminating PFAS from their product lines. We're talking huge corporations, Target, McDonald's, Home Depot, Apple, Amazon. So I think these trends have the potential to turn off the tap on these chemicals, and that is the goal. Anyone who studies these chemicals will tell you that is the goal because they persist in the environment for so long. We are going to be living with the chemicals that are already out there for many, many generations. So these developments have the potential to move us towards turning off the tap faster than regulation on a federal level, because regulation on a federal level moves slowly, and because the EPA's authority to regulate chemicals is so weak, and it's certainly not going to get stronger under this administration. So that is the good news. And this is something that is being driven largely by ordinary citizens like Adam. I mean, I think that's the part that has inspired me as I've been reporting and writing this story. It's ordinary citizens who have, in many cases, their lives have been devastated by these chemicals, but they've taken that pain and they've turned it into something powerful, and they are creating change. And, at this particular political moment, that gives me a lot of hope.
Why don't we end by, Adam, if you could give us a few thoughts about how consumers going forward can act in solidarity with farmers who in so many cases had nothing to do with the contamination that just shows up on their land. Like you guys have been arguing that we're going to be seeing this in more places. How can consumers act in solidarity with farmers to help them not have to shut their farm down or exit the business?
Yeah. So unfortunately, in so many ways, as consumers, we're powerless to protect ourselves from PFAS. We can't, some of us with the resources to do so can make conscious choices at, when we're buying products to bring into our homes. But there's no disclosure requirement for many of these chemicals. And if you don't live in a state that's phasing out their allowable use, as Mariah mentioned, like how can any consumer protect themselves and their family and their community from that? We as consumers are more than consumers. We're citizens, and we need to live in that role and demand that our policymakers and our regulators are paying close attention to this problem and are protecting us, are protecting our children, are protecting our farming communities and our farm workers. And I think that's where that solidarity is really powerful. We all live in the same food system. We all rely on clean, healthy food, and we're all linked in that food shed. So we really need to be moving this at the regulatory and policy level, and where people are showing up to do that, realizing that, yes, I have a stake. I eat food grown on farms. I want it to be clean, and I want to know that the farmers are not being put at risk when they go out and till the soil to produce my food. That's a really powerful connection, and finding that powerful connection and communicating that to your policymakers, to your local legislators. It makes a huge impact. It really does.
Fantastic. Mariah, so let's say we've turned the spigot off. That's great. That's necessary. But the stuff sticks around for 1 million years in some cases, definitely through our lifetimes and the lifetime of our children. what can consumers do? What can people do to protect themselves, to minimize their exposure to PFAS? And what role does policy play in that? Like, what are some policies that could come into play that would help people minimize their exposure to PFAS, because they're not going away when we cut the spigot off?
Yeah, I mean, on a federal level, you could have a federal ban on the application of sewage sludge. And I think there's a bill before Congress now that would reimburse farmers for their losses if they're affected by sewage sludge, because there are farmers out there who suspect that their farms are contaminated, but are wary of going public or getting it tested because their livelihoods would be destroyed. So on a federal level, there are some potential policy solutions, and we've seen bipartisan legislation, move through Congress under the first Trump administration having to do with PFAS, because this is an issue that enjoys broad bipartisan support, restricting these chemicals because it affects people in red states and blue. So, but in terms of people's personal choices, there are a few steps that can be taken. One, I would recommend that everybody filter their drinking water, if they have the means, with a system that is certified to remove PFAS. Undersink systems are the best options for most people, and they are not terribly expensive. They're usually a few $100s. So, because chances are most of us have PFAS in our drinking water, they're only testing for a couple dozen of the more than 9,000 PFAS that are out there, and that's in the places that are even testing at all. So that's one simple step people can take. I would also recommend that people use natural materials whenever possible for food cooking and storage. So stainless steel, glass, that protects you from all kinds of toxic chemicals, because a lot of plastics contain toxic chemicals that are known to leach into food and water, especially if they go into the microwave. Avoid, when possible, microwave popcorn, which has very high levels of PFAS in the bags. A lot of fast food packaging contains PFAS and other toxic chemicals, so cutting down on fast food can help. Avoid buying products that are marketed as non-stick, waterproof, stain-proof, and grease-proof. And when it comes to outdoor gear, I would recommend that people do their homework, because there are outdoor gear brands now that are PFAS-free. But if they haven't done the work, they most likely, that rain jacket, that snow jacket has PFAS in it. And another recommendation I make, and this is very directly related to food, is that people avoid eating locally caught freshwater fish. So our waterways are so polluted with these chemicals that studies have found that eating even a single portion of locally caught freshwater fish can increase your blood levels as much as drinking pretty heavily polluted water for an entire month. So I find it unfortunate, but that is the fact of the matter. And I believe EWG has additional tips and resources, and they have also looked at, they look at what foods are most likely to contain high levels of pesticides, and they may have done some work on this as well. They also have other resources, such as a database that you can use to find which cosmetics may contain PFAS and which may not, and similarly for various home goods. So resources like that can be helpful.
Mariah is talking about Environmental Working Group, ewg.org, and I'll put some more information about that into the little piece I do that will go out with this episode. The thing about freshwater fish is really hits hard for me. That's such terrible news. It's taking something so amazing away from us. And there is so much to be angry about in this PFAS story, and that is only just one little bit of it. But listen, thank you both so much for your work. It is extremely important. Everyone should buy your book, Mariah. It's a terrifying read. It's an important read. Everyone should look up Adam and figure out how to support people on the ground trying to protect us from PFAS like Adam. And thank you both so much for coming on Unconfined Podcast.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.